Noumea, New Caledonia, October 18, 1942, just before noon. Vice Admiral William Halsey is sitting in the cabin of a Navy PB-2Y flying boat that has just landed in the harbor. He has been in the air for 2 days, flying from Pearl Harbor through Christmas Island, Antuva, and Espiritu Santo. He has just finished a cup of coffee. A naval officer comes aboard and hands him a sealed envelope. Halsey opens it. He reads it twice. Then he says out loud in front of the entire crew, "Jesus Christ and General Jackson." The orders are simple. He has been relieved of his job as commander of the carrier task forces. He is being made commander of the South Pacific area. He is taking over from Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, the man who has been losing the battle for Guadalcanal for the last 2 months. Halsey was not supposed to be in this part of the Pacific at all. He was supposed to be on Enterprise, raiding Japanese island bases. He had requested this trip personally to come down and inspect the situation in person. Washington decided to make use of that. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have just handed him a campaign that the Navy is losing. 3 Marine divisions are pinned down on a single airstrip in the jungle. Their supply line is being strangled. The Japanese have run battleships into Iron Bottom Sound at night and shelled the airfield to scrap. The Marine commander, Major General Alexander Vandegrift, has been told that his men are expendable. Washington was preparing to withdraw. How does a man take over a campaign that everyone in the chain of command has already written off and turn it into the place where the Japanese Empire begins to die? That answer begins 3 months earlier, in the most disastrous opening week the United States Navy has ever experienced in any war. The American invasion of Guadalcanal began on August 7, 1942. 11,000 Marines went ashore in the first wave. The Japanese garrison on the island was 400 construction workers and a small Navy detachment. The Marines walked onto the beach largely unopposed. They captured a half-built airfield that the Japanese had been carving out of the jungle. They named it Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. Then the Navy left. On the second night of the invasion, August 9th, a Japanese cruiser force came down the slot at high speed. They surprised the American and Australian warships guarding the transports. In 32 minutes, they sank 4 heavy cruisers and damaged a 5th. They killed over 1,000 sailors. The Battle of Savo Island was the worst surface defeat in the history of the United States Navy. The American admiral commanding the screening force, Frank Fletcher, withdrew his carriers before all the supplies could be unloaded. The transports left with most of their cargo still aboard. The Marines on Guadalcanal were left with what they had carried ashore. They had 37 days of rations, 4 days of ammunition for sustained combat, no heavy artillery beyond what they had personally landed. The Navy did not come back for 2 weeks. The Marines built that airfield with their bare hands, using Japanese equipment captured on the beach. They were strafed and bombed every day. They were shelled by Japanese cruisers every night. The Japanese ran in fast destroyers down the slot at night, dropping fresh troops on the western end of the island. The Marines called the supply runs the Tokyo Express. By October, the Japanese had 30,000 troops on Guadalcanal. The Marines had 19,000. The Japanese controlled the seas around the island at night. The Americans controlled the air during the day, barely, from a single airstrip pocked with bomb craters. The man in charge of the campaign was Vice Admiral Robert Lee Gormley. He was a sound officer with a brilliant mind for naval logistics. He was also exhausted, sick, and convinced the campaign was unwinnable. On October 15th, he sent a cable to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. He wrote that his forces are totally inadequate to meet the situation. He requested permission to plan for a withdrawal. Nimitz did not give him permission. Instead, he flew to San Francisco to meet with Admiral Ernest King. The 2 men spent 48 hours making a decision that neither of them wanted to make. Gormley had to go. The replacement was not obvious. The available admirals were either committed to other commands or were not aggressive enough for what was needed. Nimitz wanted a fighter, someone who would attack first and ask questions later, someone who would not blink at losing ships. There was only one man in the Pacific who matched that description. William Frederick Halsey was 60 years old. He had been one of the Navy's first naval aviators, having earned his wings at age 52, so he could command the new aircraft carriers. He had commanded the carrier task force that launched the Doolittle raid in April. He was an Annapolis graduate from the class of 1904. He had a reputation for using language that would peel paint off a destroyer. He was also recovering from a severe skin condition called shingles that had put him in the hospital at Pearl Harbor for over a month. He had only just returned to flying duty. He was on his way to Noumea on an inspection trip when the orders found him. Halsey took the change of command at 11:30 hours on October 18th in the cabin of his flying boat, with the engines still warm. He went ashore at Noumea and walked straight into Gormley's headquarters. He read every classified file in the building over the next 36 hours. He talked to every staff officer. The picture was worse than Washington had told him. The 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal had not been resupplied in 3 weeks. They were down to 1 meal a day. They had so little aviation fuel at Henderson Field that they were siphoning gasoline out of wrecked Japanese planes and filtering it through cloth. They had no fresh aircraft because every replacement that flew in got destroyed within a day. 2 days after Halsey took command, the Marine commander on Guadalcanal, Major General Vandegrift, was flown out to Noumea for a council of war. With him came 2 senior generals from MacArthur's headquarters and Halsey's senior staff. The meeting was held in Halsey's office at 3 in the afternoon. Halsey asked one question: "Can you hold?" Vandegrift said yes. He said his Marines could hold, but only if the Navy made a real commitment: real food, real ammunition, real reinforcements, air cover that did not leave at sundown, aggressive naval action against the Tokyo Express. The Army generals at the meeting argued against the commitment. They said the Solomons campaign was an unnecessary diversion from the buildup against MacArthur's New Guinea operations. They said the Marines should be withdrawn and the island abandoned. Halsey listened to all of it. He turned to Vandegrift. He said, "Are you able to hold the island?" Vandegrift said, "Yes, sir, if I am supported." Halsey said, "You will be supported." He turned to the Army staff officers. He said, "Gentlemen, we are not going to give up that island. We are going to support General Vandegrift with everything we have. If we go down fighting. There will be no further discussion of withdrawal." He turned back to Vandegrift. He said, "Tell your boys to hold on. The Navy is coming." Vandegrift would later write that those words were the most important he heard from any senior officer in the entire campaign. Until that moment, the Marines on the island had thought they were being abandoned. Halsey now had to deliver on his promise. The first thing he did was scrape together every available ship and send them north. He took the new battleships South Dakota and Washington, which the Navy had been holding in reserve, and sent them into the Solomons. He committed the only 2 operational American carriers in the entire Pacific, Enterprise and Hornet, to a single battle. The result was the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26th. The Hornet was sunk. Enterprise was badly damaged. 2 destroyers were sunk. The Americans lost over 400 sailors and 74 aircraft. But the Japanese also lost. They lost over 100 aircraft and most of their experienced naval aviators. 2 of their carriers were knocked out of action for the rest of the year. Halsey had traded ships for time. The Japanese could not replace their pilots. The Americans could. 2 weeks later, on November 12th and 13th, the most violent naval battle of the entire Pacific War took place in Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. The Japanese sent a battleship force to bombard Henderson Field into ruin. Halsey sent everything he had left to stop them. 2 American admirals died on their flag bridges in the first hours of the fight. The cruisers Atlanta and Juno were sunk. The Juno took the 5 Sullivan brothers with her, all serving on the same ship. The Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, the first time they had ever lost a battleship in combat. The next night, Halsey sent the South Dakota and Washington back in. The Washington put 9 16-inch shells into the Japanese battleship Kirishima at point-blank range. The Kirishima went to the bottom. The Japanese broke off the battle and never sent another battleship into the Solomons again. Halsey kept attacking. Through November and December and January, his ships and planes and submarines went after every Tokyo Express run, every Japanese resupply attempt, every troop convoy heading down the slot. The Japanese could not get food to their men on Guadalcanal. Their soldiers began to starve. They named the island Gato to Starvation Island. On February 7, 1943, the Japanese began the secret evacuation of their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. They got out 10,000 starving, sick men under cover of darkness. They abandoned 20,000 of their dead. The American flag went up over the entire island 3 days later. Guadalcanal was the first Allied ground victory against Japan in the Pacific War. It was also the place where the Imperial Japanese Navy lost its margin. The Japanese had entered the war with a small, professional, highly trained naval aviation cadre. They had spent 10 years building those pilots. Each one had thousands of flight hours. They were the best carrier pilots in the world in 1941. The campaign for the Solomons from August 1942 to February 1943 destroyed them. The Japanese lost over 600 experienced naval aviators in the air battles over Guadalcanal. They lost 2 carriers and dozens of other warships in the surface battles. Most importantly, they lost the time they needed to train replacements. By the end of 1943, the Japanese carrier air groups were filled with green pilots with fewer than 200 flight hours. The Americans, who had been mass-producing trained aviators since 1940, were sending pilots with 500 flight hours into combat. The skill gap that opened in the Solomons was never closed. In June 1944, when the next major carrier battle was fought off the Marianas, the Americans shot down 410 Japanese aircraft for the loss of 29 of their own. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was so one-sided, the American pilots called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. That gap between American and Japanese aviation skill opened over Henderson Field in October and November 1942. It was created by William Halsey's decision not to leave. Douglas MacArthur said it best after the war. He said, "Before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours." The shift from Japan advancing to Japan retreating started with one man reading a sealed envelope in the cabin of a flying boat in the harbor at Noumea. After the war was over, Halsey was asked many times about what he had done at Noumea. He was asked if he had felt the pressure of the decision, if he had ever wavered. He always said the same thing. He said, "I did not make any decision. The decision had been made. The decision was made by every Marine on that island who decided to stay there with his rifle, every cook and clerk and supply officer who decided not to quit. I was just the man who had to tell them they would not be left there alone." He was promoted to 5-star Fleet Admiral in December 1945, only the 4th officer in the history of the United States Navy to hold that rank. The other 3 were Leahy, King, and Nimitz. He retired in 1947. He spent the rest of his life writing his memoirs, attending Navy reunions, and refusing every speaking offer that paid more than expenses. He died on August 16, 1959, while attending a Naval Academy class reunion. He was 76 years old. His pallbearers included 6 men who had served under him in the Solomons. One of them had been a quartermaster on a destroyer at the Battle of Santa Cruz. One of them had been a Marine private at Henderson Field. The others had been admirals. They carried him together. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the United States Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, or the Merchant Marine in the Solomon Islands campaign, leave their name in the comments below. Their unit, their ship, where they served. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did, or one thing they said, or one thing you remember. The men who held that island deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.